The Big Ten occupies half of the top 8 in this week's AP poll. Will they occupy that same territory when the initial college football playoff rankings drop on Tuesday night? That and much more as we wrap up Week 10 and take a trip around this big old nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Tuesday night is a very important night for this country. The future is going to be on the line because precedents will be set by the College Football Playoff Committee when these initial rankings drop. A lot of times where the committee ranks these teams right off the bat really sets the precedent on if they can get into a certain at-large spot in the college football playoff, even teams towards the bottom of the rankings, just how high they can raise. We're going to find out a lot about what the College Football Playoff Committee thinks about some of these teams in the Big Ten right off the bat. Now, let's recap everything that happened in Week 10 as we look forward towards that event, the most important event of the night on Tuesday night. Now, some quick hitters before I get into the main talking points following week number 10. I'm going to be talking about USC and Nebraska and their struggles later in the week in more detail, so I just want to start off with some bullet points with the Trojans and the Huskers right now. They are regressing at an alarming rate right now. These are two teams that had a lot of high hopes early in the season. These are two fan bases that are pretty down in the dumps right now. USC just lacks that mental toughness. They lack that mentality. They lack that fight to be able to win some of these close football games right now. Miller Moss has been regressing. I know that they've had some injuries on the defensive side of the football, but every time I watch a Lincoln Riley press conference, it reminds me how delusional he is as a head coach right now. He's talking about, hey, we're 5, 6, 7, 8 plays away from being an unbelievable team right now. But yet, you know what? Good teams, unbelievable teams, they make those plays. A lot like you made those plays against LSU in the opening game of the season. And then when you look at the Nebraska Cornhuskers, this offense has completely fallen off of a cliff. Marcus Satterfield should not be allowed back in the building. Those are two teams that have a lot of questions to be answered because bowl games are not guaranteed for either of those squads right now. Let's get to some positives. UCLA is showing a lot of fight within their football program right now. But it's become very clear to me that Deshaun Foster has installed a culture where this team is going to fight and this team is going to improve each and every single week that goes by. Look, they're clearly not the most talented team, but they're playing very hard for their head coach. There is a path to a bowl game for UCLA. And if the Bruins can find their way to the postseason, they get those extra bowl practices. And for the momentum that they had recruiting-wise in the offseason, that provides a little bit in the second half of the season. That would provide a little bit of a proof of concept going forward for UCLA right now. This is going to be a tough game on Friday night. They host Iowa at the Rose Bowl, but at Washington versus USC versus Fresno State, there's a path to 6-6 for the Bruins. But kind of like a lot of teams in the month of November, they need to be playing their best football, and they need to keep on improving as a program. Now let's kind of go back to the negative. Ryan Walters, I believe, is done. I believe he is cooked after that overtime loss to Northwestern. Now, I think he was done. I think he was cooked well before this. But here's the thing about Walters, who's 5-15 overall in his tenure in West Lafayette, 3-11 in Big Ten play. What is it about college football? You need to be able to sell the hope of a program. You need to have some immediate momentum. Ryan Walters is able to do neither of those things right now. And the team that's in state is having as big of a turnaround as anybody. They're as good of a story as anybody. Remember this. And I talked about this all the way back in the summer with my buddy Boiler Dowd from Boiled Sports. And I talked about, hey, are you concerned about that transfer exodus that you had? He's like, well, maybe not this year. But if it happens again, then yeah, that's going to be alarming. And I think that there is a potential of 11-1, 1-11 for Purdue this season. And if that happens, I think some of that recruiting momentum that Purdue had in the offseason, some of those guys could have some second thoughts. And I think you could see another exodus from this Purdue program. Will he get fired this year? That remains to be seen. We go from the bottom to the top of the Big Ten and the top of college football. The more weeks that go by, the more it is established that the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes are the teams in college football. When ESPN brings on their broadcast and they talk about these first college football playoff rankings, they're probably going to be talking about which teams are going to be those teams at the top that are national championship contenders. And right now, 1 and 2, it should be the Oregon Ducks and it should be the Ohio State Buckeyes. And that's how the College Football Playoff Committee should rank this thing. Oregon number 1 and Ohio State number 2. I think a big reason why these two teams have established themselves as the two top teams in college football, as the national championship contenders in college football, is depth. And this weekend, Week 10, was a great example of that. Look at when Tez Johnson went down for Oregon, Trayshawn Holden stepped up and had himself a game. You look at the injuries on the offensive line to Ohio State, they shift things around. Donovan Jackson over to left tackle. You got a guy like Carson Hinsman that steps up and does well on the offensive line. They have depth at that position. Ohio State and Oregon have as much depth as anybody right now in all of college football. You look at some of the contenders, like you look at a team like Georgia, they've had, we'll say challenges. I don't want to say struggles. They've had challenges against teams like Florida this past week, and what happens in that game if DJ Lagway doesn't go down. You look at that Kentucky game a little bit earlier on in the season. They lost to an Alabama team that I haven't been overly impressed with so far this season. You look at Miami. It seems like they are on the brink of disaster every single week. Look, Cam Ward is statistically the best quarterback in the country, but man, you look at, I know they eventually ran away with it against Duke, but there's been some games where Miami, they needed a big comeback to beat Cal on the road in Berkeley earlier this season. They haven't been the most impressive team over there in the ACC. You look at Texas. I thought Texas was maybe the best team in the country a little bit earlier on this season. Of course, Georgia went out, and I failed to mention Georgia having that great defense, maybe not being sold with the Bulldogs offense, but that defense played great against this Texas offense. And you look at Texas kind of going toe-to-toe with Vanderbilt in that game. Like, you look at the SEC, and the SEC is going to be very compelling. It's going to be very competitive in the back half of the season. And maybe the Big Ten is a little bit top heavy, but hey, that top is as good as it gets right now with the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State is coming off a big win this Saturday in Happy Valley against the Penn State Nittany Lions, which is where I want to go with this thing right now. What's next for Penn State? That's the big question. How do you respond from yet another loss to the Ohio State Buckeyes? Now, you can like James Franklin or you cannot like James Franklin, right? You cannot like the results that he's had in some of these big games, but what he said in the post-game press conference after the Ohio State game rings true. College football is different. College football is new. Losing this game to Ohio State is not the be-all, and it's not the end-all that it once was. There is still a lot in front of the Penn State Nittany Lions right now. Here's the thing about this game, about Ohio State, as it pertains to the future for Penn State. You cannot let this game bring you down. They say it all the time. You can't let this team beat you twice. The remainder of the schedule, Penn State is going to be Vegas favorites in every single one of those games. You need to be able to rebound. You need to be able to respond. You need to be able to put this game behind you and play your best football the remainder of the season and be a hot football team, 11-1, going into the college football playoff. And let's think about this for a minute. This was a close game. This was a 7-point game against one of the best teams in the country, a team that I just said is probably one of the two top teams in the country. Well, they are one of the two top teams in the country. They are a true national championship contender. And you failed to convert in the red zone 2 times. You make plays in the red zone, we might be talking about a different result. Now, we also might not, but we might be talking about a little bit of a different outcome. So I know a loss seems like just another loss in a line of consecutive losses since 2016 for James Franklin and Penn State in this series, but if Penn State can really hone in on some of the things that they weren't able to capitalize on in this Ohio State game and get better as the season goes on, there's still a lot in front of the Penn State Nittany Lions right now. A team in the Big Ten that's playing as good a football as anybody, yeah, it's those Indiana Hoosiers. And we talked at the top of this show about the College Football Playoff Committee. And I really hope that, I'm not sure if I have the most trust, but I really hope the College Football Playoff Committee slaps a whole bunch of respect on the Indiana Hoosiers because they absolutely deserve it. I could care less. Well, maybe I could care a little bit, but I don't really care all that much as to who they've played. They've played in a Power 2 conference, and they have opened up a can of whoop-ass on everybody that they have played this season. They have been ultra impressive. I understand people that have the weak schedule argument, and I would understand that if they were playing close games and they were squeaking by Maryland and they were squeaking by UCLA and they were squeaking by Michigan State, I could understand that. But they're beating these teams by 20, by 30, by 40 points. If you can't look at this team and see a top 8 team in the country, I don't know how to help you. Danny Kanell of CBS Sports, I think, put it very bluntly, and I think he really laid it out correctly. He said, if they had a winged helmet, if they had Buckeye leaves on the back of their helmet, nobody would be doubting that this is a top 5 football program. But because they don't have a big brand behind them, people are hesitant to maybe put them at that level. And that kind of goes into the whole issue with the committee, with college football in general, and the big brand bias that can certainly exist right now. But you have to look at Indiana as independently as you can. Will the College Football Playoff Committee do that? Boy, I tell you what, if BYU or Notre Dame or, God forbid, Alabama, that's kind of the one that I'm spooked a little bit of the most. We just had Halloween, where Alabama, this is a team that beat Georgia, has a really good win earlier on in the season, but has 2 losses. Will the committee look at that big win and compare it to Indiana's schedule and say, hey, Alabama, we think, might be a better football team right now? If BYU, Notre Dame, and Bama are ranked of IU, there should be bloodshed. But where they slot in these initial college football playoff rankings, I think is going to tell us a lot of how the committee views the Indiana Hoosiers, certainly going forward. I'm going to finish with 2 teams that are absolutely surging right now: the Iowa Hawkeyes and the Minnesota Golden Gophers. I talked about the top 4 in the conference. I talked about Oregon. I talked about Ohio State, those national championship contenders. Then you go down to those playoff caliber teams, the Penn States and the Indianas of the world. Now when you get past those 4 teams that might be playing for a national championship, or at least in the conversation in the playoff at the end of the year, who's the best of the rest? I kind of tackled some candidates last week, and now I think it's very clear. It's the 6-3 Iowa Hawkeyes. It's the 6-3 Minnesota Golden Gophers. Let's talk first about the black and gold of those folks that are playing in Iowa City. I love the spark that Brendan Sullivan has given this Iowa offense. I am a big believer in strengthening your strengths. And I believe Brendan Sullivan strengthens an already really strong run game that has one of the best backs in the country in Caleb Johnson, probably should be a Heisman Trophy candidate, should be talked about more in that conversation, and he's got a really good run-blocking offensive line. Brendan Sullivan brings a different wrinkle, brings a different perspective to the run game, running from the quarterback position, something that the Iowa Hawkeyes have not had, well, let's just say a very long time with Kirk Ferentz being their head coach. Now, Brendan Sullivan, not much of a passing threat, but when you run the football as good as Iowa does, you don't really need to throw the ball out that much. Sullivan, 7 of 10, 93 yards against Wisconsin, but I love what he's added, another dimension to this Iowa Hawkeyes run game, which is already the strength of this football team. How about the Minnesota Golden Gophers? This was a team that was sitting there at 2-3. They have now rattled off 4 consecutive wins. A big reason why is a quarterback that's in the conversation to be a top 6, maybe a top 5 quarterback in this conference, and that's Max Brosmer. Ever since he has really settled into this offense, he's gotten a lot more comfortable in this offense. That's when Minnesota has really taken off. Really, ever since, the second half of that game against Michigan, that's when things really started to turn the corner for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Since that Michigan loss, Brosmer has 3 games where he's had a 70% completion percentage or better, 7 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, and they're finding a lot more balance. Remember, this was a team that really wasn't running the football all that much, even though Darius Taylor, one of the best running backs of the Big Ten, was back there in that backfield. Now you're finding Brosmer doing well, and Darius Taylor is getting into that mold and into that role that we certainly expected him to be in. 3 straight games with a touchdown rush. They're finding their balance. I believe this is the best balance on offense and the best passing attack that Minnesota has had since that great 2019 team where they had Rashad Bateman, where they had Tyler Johnson on the outside. Folks, Minnesota, they have some serious upset potential on November 23rd when the Nittany Lions come to Dinkytown. This is a Minnesota team. 9-3 is certainly on the table. I tend to favor 8-4 and them being competitive with Penn State later on during the season. But man, PJ Fleck, build him any sort of lakeside cabin that he wants in the land of 10,000 lakes, because, that 11-win season, he had a couple of 9-4 years. Yes, he took a little bit of a step down, but if he can bounce back to an 8-win season, this is not an easy program to win at. But what PJ has done is he has slapped row the boat. He has slapped oars all over that program. I've been in that tunnel that leads out to the stadium. There are hundreds of oars on that wall. This is the identity of Minnesota football, and PJ Fleck has won in a place where it is not easy to win in the Big Ten Conference. Folks, that is everything Week 10 within the Big Ten. Now we sit here, now we wait to see what Tuesday night's rankings will look like. I will have coverage on Wednesday, my reaction of those very first college football playoff rankings. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.